have with us Brother Maurice Finn, who belongs to the Congregation of Christian Brothers. The congregation was founded by Blessed Edmund Ignatius Rice in 1802. It's a pleasure to have you with us, brother.
Thank you.
Your founder is Blessed Edmund Rice, who was from Ireland. Could you tell us a little bit about the island at that time?
Actually, to tell you about the Ireland of Edmund's time, you've got to go back some hundreds of years, because England, our neighbouring island, always cast envious eyes on Ireland, and they wanted to rule in Ireland. And there were various attempts over the years, but in the time of Elizabeth and Henry VIII, her father, a big thing occurred when Henry VIII put himself as the head of the church. Then he wanted to make it obligatory for all the people whom he was ruling over to accept him as the head of the church. And the Irish refused to acknowledge him as such. So there were very iniquitous laws brought in where one had to swear to deny certain tenets of the Catholic faith before one could take any kind of public office. Own land. As a result of which, the Irish people who were there were put out of their holdings, Protestant retainers from England put in, and the church, the Catholic Church, was outlawed. That meant that the Catholics couldn't be educated and they were very, very poor. So the penal laws were still in vogue when Edmund was a young boy in Callan in County Kilkenny. And because of the tenet about where you could not be educated if you were a Catholic, you had to deny certain parts of your religion and be brought up as a Protestant, then you got all the benefits. Edmund's schooling was rather haphazard. In those days you had what they called hedge schools, and literally sometimes these were groups of children sheltering under a hedge, taught by a teacher. More often than not, the teacher was a man who had gone to the continent to become a priest and decided that the priesthood wasn't for him, so he came back to Ireland and there was nothing for him to do, so he would set up a hedge school. And the poor people went to him and they had a few pennies, they paid him that, they brought turf and a few things like that, turf to burn in the fire. So Edmund was living in a big house because they had leased quite an amount of land. Some landlords were more magnanimous than others, and Edmund was lucky. There was a big family. His mother was a very pious lady. Actually, she had been married before she married Edmund's father. Her husband died, she had 2 daughters from that marriage, and then Edmund's 5 children came along, Edmund and his brothers. And they had visiting their home what they call An Brahrain Lia, which means the little grey friar.
Okay.
He has come to the house, spent time with them, probably taught them something from the Bible and things like that. And he would have been a great influence in the young Edmund's life, who enjoyed all the games that were played by the people in the country at that time, and who led a normal country boy's life.
Okay. We are given to believe that Edmund was a very wealthy man. How did this all come about?
Well, in the sense that his family was privileged because they had these leased property,
okay,
which they farmed and did well.
Okay.
And also his uncle Michael was down in the city of Waterford. And Michael took the young Edmund down to Waterford to work with him. He had a liquor business that would appeal very much to Goans. There were plenty of tavernas in those days. And he worked with him. And Edmund was very, very methodical, absolutely scrupulous when it came to keeping accounts. This is before computers.
Wow, that's great.
And he did so well that at his work that the uncle kind of made him a partner and put him in charge. So by the time he was in his early 20s, he would have had a lot of property, money, cattle collected. And he also got into the business of ships chandling.
Okay.
That is, he outfitted ships that were coming into this port in Waterford, and because of all that, he seemed to have a lot of money. He seemed to be very, very wealthy.
Okay. So what was life like for Edmund in Waterford in those times?
Yes, well, at those days, the Protestants were in the ascendancy. All the people who were in the high positions in the town of Waterford were Protestant. But Edmund, because he was such an honest and successful man, he had lots of friends among the Protestants.
Okay.
So their homes were open to him. And it was quite common in those days that they would have parties. And Edmund would go to these parties, and young men and women would be there, all very correct, and they would dance and have a meal and sing. And Edmund was quite a good singer.
Oh.
And he used to join in the sing songs and enjoyed it. So his social life was good, he was working hard, but one thing that remained with him, probably because of this little grey brother and because of his mother's influence, he was very given to the Mass. He was a daily Mass goer, and he was very interested in his religion and the idea of being helpful to the poor. Apart from all those he employed, he was also a charitable man.
Okay. So it's a very happening life. And I heard there was a tragedy in his life which shifted the course of his life. So can you tell us a little bit about the tragedy out of it?
Now, the tragedy was a terrible tragedy, actually, because at 27 years of age, now he had married 2 years earlier. He had married Mary Elliott, and Mary was pregnant when we were told there was an accident. Now, it's said that she was riding. In those days they didn't have motorbikes and they didn't have cars, so she was on horseback when she fell, and the baby was born. The baby was both mentally and physically retarded,
Okay.
but the wife died. So here is a man, a successful businessman, a young man, and he is left widowed and with a child, a baby girl who was handicapped. That was a big tragedy in his life.
Yeah. You set up a Christian Brothers school in Chikalim in Goa.
Yeah.
Now, Chikalim is far away from Waterford city.
Yeah.
Why did the brothers decide to come to Goa?
Yeah, well, that's a long thing too. You see, we go back to Edmund.
Okay.
After his wife's death, he redoubled his efforts to be charitable. And he saw how privileged he was, and he had a big home not far from the docks where he worked.
Okay.
And he saw all these wild boys running around, unschooled, ignorant, and because they were ignorant, they were vicious. And he wanted to do something for them. So he used to take them home, and he would feed them and teach them. And the people in the locality weren't too happy at having these ragamuffins around the place.
Okay.
It went on further because he decided that he would start a regular school for boys. Now this, according to the government, would be totally illegal. Catholics weren't permitted to set up schools. So not having garages in those days, they had stables in which a number of coaches for different purposes were kept and their horses, and he converted his stable into a school. So he collected the children, the boys from around, and got them there, and he employed people to teach them. The people whom he employed, 2 men whom he had employed, it came after a week. They found it tough going, they couldn't manage. He redoubled what he was paying them, and still that wasn't sufficient. And it was at that stage that he had to go in himself first of all and look after the children he collected, And then two men from his hometown came along and joined him voluntarily. So they started that school. And while doing that and living together and praying together, the idea of starting a religious order came to Edmund.
Okay.
And like there was, what you might call, a long discernment process before things were set in motion.
Okay.
Now, our brothers, we came to India first in 1848.
Okay.
But these were people whom we were associated with us and really weren't full brothers of our congregation. We amalgamated with them in 1890.
Okay.
And we looked after poor children in Calcutta.
Okay.
You had a lot of Irish men who had joined the British Army because there was nothing else for them. So they took the King's shilling, joined the British Army, and during the Afghan war, many of them were killed. Now, unlike the English officers, these Irish soldiers, foot soldiers, married local girls. And when they were killed in the war, their children were in a very bad way in Calcutta. So the Loreto sisters came to Calcutta to look after them. And then we had these two brothers who trained with us, and in 1848 they took over the boys in Morghehata.
Okay. That's in Calcutta?
In Calcutta.
Okay.
And this went on 1890. Our brothers amalgamated with the 18 to 20 brothers, we'll call them the Calcutta brothers, who were there because they found that they weren't viable as a group. And they had started two schools, which are still there, by the way, in Calcutta.
Okay.
And when the brothers, 4 brothers came from Ireland and the 20 brothers that they had from India, they were asked to go elsewhere. So they went to Asansol, they went to Nainital in a very short while.
Okay.
These schools tended to become a little bit more elitist because you had the British officers wanted their sons educated, and here they saw, I'm not being politically incorrect, but this is the mentality, here were Europeans or white people,
okay,
and they wanted them to teach their boys.
Okay.
So after a while, I'd say there was a kind of a movement in the opposite direction, that the brothers became very concerned, maybe sometimes too much so, about the better off ones.
Okay.
So while we kept the free school and the orphanage going, now we were reaching out to people who were better off.
Okay.
And in fact, some of the schools became quite elitist.
Okay.
Now, in 1960, around that time, we had this Vatican Council, Vatican II, where the people from all over the world had a good look at the church. And you had meetings in Rome for 2 years. And they examined things the way they were, and they found that religious orders had drifted quite a bit from what they were founded for. And all religious orders were told to go back to the spirit of your founder, to inculcate that. And at that time, well, we began to look more at Edmund Rice, what he did, what he stood for, and people began to see that there was far more in Edmund Rice than teaching schools, because he was a man who looked after what they called the Mendicity Institute, people who were homeless, those who had addictions. He was always visiting jails, very frequently on the gallows when a man was being executed. And in his school in Ireland, first of all, when he started that school in Mount Sion, when he left the stable in his own home, he opened a bakery to feed the people who were coming. He had a tailoring department to make clothes for the kids who were coming, and shoes. He had a place for making shoes. So our American general, way back in 1960, was telling us that we had become so elitist that we had neglected lots of Christians in India who were in need of quality education, and particularly in the West, because on the West Coast it was quite Catholic. There was Goa, Bombay, Mangalore. We had lots of Catholics there, so he gave us an order, a hookup, open up a school in the West.
Okay.
Go to the West. Go West, young man. So that is, we went into Dadar in 1968, and then something came up in Goa, so that's where I came in. I was sent to Chickley to start a school. At that time, we had the Presentation Sisters in Vasco. In fact, the land that we built on subsequently had been first offered to them in 1958.
Okay.
By 1969, they hadn't got it. And that's when we were invited to come and build something there on that plot near the monument. So I was very conscious of the fact that I was in a port town like Waterford. Ships were coming in the same way. At that time, Waterford was the second biggest port in Europe. Huge amount of maritime business there. And the job that Edmund Rice had as ship chandler, some of the parents of the boys who were coming to school, that's what they were doing.
So you got the connection between
Connection, and the Presentation Sisters who inspired Edmund in their work for girls, they were there.
Okay.
So, I mean, for me it was a very personal thing, but I felt very close to Edmund Rice at that time.
Okay.
And whatever difficulties I had were minimized by that association.
Oh, very interesting. So tell me one thing that fascinates you about Edmund Rice. Any story or something like that? Something?
Yeah, well, there are so many incidents in his life, and I suppose the one that had a great influence on him and subsequently on brothers like myself, he had helped foreigners. Now, people, the Irish were poor, but you had slaves at that time.
Okay.
And here, one day, Edmund is on the docks about his business, and there was a sea captain beating an African boy, a slave boy. And Edmund objected. And the captain said, I can do with it what I like with him. I own him. I bought him.
Oh.
Edmund said, name your price and I'll buy him from you. Which he did.
Oh,
And he set up this Johnny, as he called him, he was known as a Black Johnny, and got him working. And the man became a very devout person. He became the sacristan in the local church and things like that. There were others as well, like Bianconi was a little Italian boy on the docks, again with pictures, could speak no English. He was selling pictures here and that, not exactly postcards. And Edmund took him in, gave him shelter, set him up, and started him off, and he set up a transport system, like Kadamba, as we have it today.
Okay.
So Bianconi had this stagecoach business to the whole of Ireland. He prospered. But the incident that is a very telling one. Edmund was travelling through the country on one of Bianconi's coaches. So that they could travel so far in the course of a day, then they'd have to stay at an hostelry there, kind of an inn. And Edmund was staying, and in the room with him was a monk, a priest. And through the night, when Edmund was sleeping, he noticed that this man was kneeling at his bedside praying. And that had a profound influence on Edmund. He was trying to put everything into perspective. And putting it into perspective, he saw, well, he had his great share of joys and happiness and tragedy. Wealth he had, which he gave away. You know, when he was starting off, were people suspicious of what he was doing. Some said his wife's death 12 years before had influenced him, that he's losing his marbles, he was going mad. So he's made all his wealth over to the bishop. So the bishop said, okay, good. You're a good man, you're on the right course, you're not self-aggrandizement. And he said, okay, we'll continue as we are. And the following week, the bishop died. So So Edmund's influence and his attraction towards the religious life, his own tragedy, the poor children who needed some type of education, and the fact that he was conscious of the divine. We have not here a lasting city, but we seek one to come. And it was a cousin of his who kind of changed him from wanting to become a monk on the continent of Europe, like his brother had become, his brother John. Said to him, can you not do something for the boys here in Waterford as the presentation sisters are doing for the girls?
Okay.
So it was with that in mind that our general, so many years later, said the brothers should be more this side on the west coast, where there were Catholics who weren't so well off and who needed quality education.
Okay. So, according to you, who is a brother?
Well, I've been 72 years in the brothers and I'm still trying to work out who a brother is. Because the idea that I had early on of a brother was I came from a brother school, I went joined the brothers from that, and I saw the brothers as very dedicated men, very prayerful men too, who had a very austere life and who taught. Now, if I had known more about Edmund Rice, I'd have seen that there was much more to being brother than that. And actually, when the government began to take over the work of education, which the brothers were doing voluntarily, people would ask, well, why become a brother if you want to be a teacher? You can become a teacher and a good Catholic educator without being a brother. Then other things came up after Vatican II, where a lot of nuns began to lobby, looking for ordination, for priesthood. It was a big movement within the church. So in all that, where does the brother fit in? You've got the priesthood, the hierarchical structure. Now here are the nuns looking for kind of recognition and an ordination at a higher level than they've been having. The brother is male. He could be a priest, but he's not. He chose to be a brother under vows, just like the sisters. So in a sense, the easiest answer to you, it might be a bit funny in some ways, the easiest answer I could find to you, who is a brother? A brother is a male nun.
Okay.
You know, so nothing to do with the priesthood. And very, very interestingly, the last two popes, both Francis and Benedict, took the names of brothers. And that was no accident.
Okay.
I think they're trying to get away from the idea, the structure that people had of a male-dominated clerical church with all the power. They're trying to do something about that, diffuse it. And I believe that's where the brothers' vocation is today, to reach out to the people who are marginalized and poor, to be a leaven in the society. And ordination is a sacrament. Final vows, final profession in a religious order is not a sacrament.
Okay.
And this is the answer, probably a theological answer, but maybe you could get your head around it a little bit. A sacrament means a sign, and the priesthood is a sign of something, okay? Whatever it is, just matrimony is a sign of something. All these are signs. The religious life is supposed to be a reality, not just a sign of something, but a reality. And this puzzled me, so I went to a friend of mine once who was very, very charismatic, not very educated, but I went to this lady and I said, look, this has been bothering me about the vocation of a brother. She says, why are you coming to me, brother? I said, no, I want you to pray and maybe you can come up with something. She says, okay, so she prayed and she opened the Bible. She said, brother, I'm reading something here, but I don't understand it. It says here, when the people asked Jesus about the man who died leaving no issue, and his widow married all 5 brothers and died without issue. And they asked him, whose wife will she be? Because they all had her to wife.
That's true.
So Jesus said, you don't understand. In the life to be, there is no marriage or giving in marriage. No marriage and giving. But you must live in love. And that is the vocation of a brother and of a sister. Basically.
Okay.
Whatever their apostolic work, that's different. But for their own identity, that's where they belong.
Okay, very interesting. Now, 5th of May is Edmund Rice's feast day.
Yes.
How is that this man was not known for a very long time, was beatified, or was called Blessed Edmund Rice
Yes.
in 1996?
Yeah.
I mean, what are the factors that led to, you know?
Yeah, some have mentioned already that we continued as we were mainly running schools, and we thought of Edmund Rice as our founder. But we knew very little about him. In fact, I was a brother for some years before I realized that he had been married and that he had had a child. It was kind of hushed up. And it was, I think, Vatican II, which got all religious orders to look back on their founding charism, that got us interested in Edmund. So then we began to, lots of money also was spent in getting people to examine his life, to get together many things about him. And like yourself, the question, why was there so little known about him? Now, had he been a priest, it would have been different. But he was a layman who founded a religious order. There's no other layman. Like, you had the Christian brothers in France, De La Salle brothers, they were founded by a priest. This is unprecedented. A layman founding a religious order, a man who'd been married and had a child, taking religious vows of chastity, poverty and obedience. So I think they didn't open the topic very well. Also, the brothers didn't have access to the archives in the Archdiocese of Dublin and elsewhere, because the archives don't, not just all the good things that happened in the church, all the bad things were there as well. And I think we, because we weren't priests, weren't given access to these archives to find out about Edmund Rice. So when we did, there were some objections to him. Some said that he had become insane, that he'd been disobedient and disobeyed the next superior general, and that he wasn't a very moral man. Our American general, Austin Loftus, said, okay, take these out in the open, let's examine them.
Okay.
Which is very, very interesting, because some of the stuff that he's supposed to have written, it was clearly proved that it was a forgery. And so the other objections they had also to his sanity and his life not being up to scratch, all these were scotched, all gone. So now this cause is kind of been promoted more, and they want a miracle in Rome before his case is accepted. So people were encouraged to pray to Edmund Rice, has come to intercede. And interestingly enough, the miracle which was ultimately responsible for Edmund Rice being beatified was performed on a person I know.
Okay.
I had met this young man, and my novice master was a friend of the family, and told me about this boy, Kevin Ellison. When he was 11, 12 years of age, all his insides disintegrated like porridge.
Okay.
His case was hopeless. Even if he drank fluid to come through the walls of outside, everything was gone. So his case was absolutely hopeless, medically. And Brother O'Donnell, my novice master, asked the family, were they prepared to hand over Kevin to Edmund Rice's intercession and ask him to have a cure, a miraculous cure. So they did that, and the boy was in Daisy Hale Hospital, Protestant hospital in Newry, And one of the Catholic nurses had put a little statue of St. Joseph in his room. St. Joseph, the patron of a happy death. And the boy was going, not that he had anything against St. Joseph, but he and all of them are conscientized. Everything is to be placed in the hands of Edmund Rice.
Okay.
And when I met that man, he was working in our school in Uri, married with 2 children.
Interesting.
Miraculous cure.
Yeah.
And there was a sworn private commission and all that went on for years, proved beyond yea or nay that it was a miraculous cure. And I met him again in Rome at the beatification, because he was one of those who brought the gifts up at the offertory.
Okay. So the last question to you is, what do you want people to take away from this interview?
Well, I'd have to start with myself, actually.
Okay.
That I should be more given to Edmund Rice's life, to find out more about the man and to admire him for his virtues. Now, I'm starting at the end as a brother, but Edmund Rice was a young man who, very faithful to his religious practices, who worked so hard and was so honest that he was recognized right across the board. He was a young man who could enjoy life but still be conscious of the poor and other people who were less privileged. And then he was a married man who had the tragedy of his wife's death, the untimely death of his wife, and having a child to rear. By the way, he looked after that child. He arranged for his stepsister to look after Mary, who outlived Edmund. So he's a man for all seasons. There's hardly a person who couldn't have something to identify with in Edmund Rice's life.
So there's something for everyone in it.
Yeah, the fact that he did so much for women, got them homes, put them in the Mendicity Institute. I mean, today we're talking about the girl child, he's there. So many other things. In the political scene, he was there also, not as a political person, but trying to smooth things out. Very ecumenical in the people that he had, the friends that he had, the people with whom he associated. So honest in his business, and as I said, all the time conscious of the other person. So I would hope that people would be a little bit more curious about Edmund Rice, look him up on the internet, and maybe ask him to intercede when they have a problem.
Great. Thank you so much for joining with us today. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Thank you.